Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies week after week. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. I'm a Torah teacher at a real-life congregation, Kehilat Tenuvah, the Harvest Congregation in Thornton, Colorado. Love to have you come on out and join us on a Saturday, a Shabbat, for our services. You can go to grafted-in.com for more details in case this is your first time watching one of my videos. These live internet studies are called live because I bring them to you from the home studio that I call my from the computer that I call my home studio. But I'm doing it live right now, in so much as that you can join me live as well via Teams. Go to my website at tetzetorah.com, tetzetorah.com. In fact, let me just pop it open for you. I should have had this opened up earlier. Here we go. tetzetorah.com is my own home website. If you look right along the very top, there's that yellow banner running along the full length of the banner. If you click that, it will bring you to the Live Internet Studies page. And as you see, if I scroll down, there's information about each live study. On that page, click on that purple banner with the T on it. That's Teams. If you click that and you're using a computer, it will launch Teams in your browser, and you don't even have to have Teams installed on your computer. You can join us each week live, and that way, at the end of each study, I open up the microphones and we dialogue about the topic or about whatever we'd like to. We talk usually for about half an hour or something like that. It doesn't get recorded, doesn't go anywhere. So it's exclusive to the live internet studies. I'd love to have you join me each week live. There's no cost. It's absolutely free. You don't even need a Teams account. You don't even need a Microsoft account or anything like that. Your browser will do all the work for you. If you're on a smart device like iPhone, iPad, Android device or something like that, I think you do need to install Teams. Okay, let's go over to the first study. These live internet studies are an hour and a half long. And the first study is entitled Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End-Time Events. It's the hour-long part, segment 1, and it is where we talk about all things related to end-time prophecy. Right now we're in the middle of wrapping up. We're continuing to talk about rapture views, but it's in the final analysis part. It's just kind of been going on for a little while because rapture has a lot to talk about. The second study is entitled, it's a 30-minute study. It's entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism. And as you can hear from the name, it is an apologetic study about Trinity topics. Right now we are wrapping up our last verse in a series of passages from the Old Testament that are normally understood to be Trinitarian in nature, but we're allowing the challenger, biblicalunitarian.com, to challenge us to rethink these passages in a Unitarian manner. And so I'm taking the Trinitarian position. Unitarian.com is the challenger. It's kind of like a mock debate, even though they're not really here. And that takes place for about 30 minutes. So join me for that second half of the study if you're interested in that topic. Okay, on to the rapture topic tonight. Topic 12, Rapture Views, a Final Analysis. Here's where we're going. We originally started with gotquestions.org's question on this particular rapture position. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? Now, in order to understand where I'm going with my answer to them, we have to go with the differing views that I'm entertaining. There are four main historic premillennial views of the rapture. There's in no particular order, there's the pre-tribulational rapture, the mid-tribulational rapture, the post-tribulational rapture, and a view that I hold to called the pre-wrath rapture. Now, what are these views? Briefly, let me explain them. Get out my little drawing tools. The first one I'm going to talk about is the pre-trib rapture. The pre-trib rapture has a rapture at the very beginning of what they call a 7-year tribulation. I don't think it should be called a 7-year tribulation. I do believe in the 7 years, but I don't believe that all of it is tribulation. So I'm going to say so-called 7-year tribulation. Either way, the rapture is right at the very beginning. They've got some notable features, a second coming at the far end, or at the very end of the second coming, in which the salvation of Israel should take place at the very end of that 7 years. The 7 years is made up of 2 3.5 year components. The first 3.5 years is kind of a generic tribulation. The second 3.5 years is what they call the Great Tribulation. Pre-tribulation rapturists believe the church will be raptured before this final 7-year period that I call Daniel's 70th week. I think that's a more biblically accurate name. It doesn't mean that the entire week is tribulation, but it does mean that it's a special 7-year time frame set apart by God to bring about all of the purposes that God has pre-planned should happen before we usher in the eventual kingdom of his son. Let's move to the next one. This one is called the mid-tribulation rapture. Give me a second, get out my little drawing tool here. The mid-trib rapture, let me circle it or highlight it there. The mid-tribulation rapture has many of the same features as the pre-trib rapture. It's got a 3.5 year time frame at the beginning. It's got a great tribulation at the very end. At the second half. It's got the second coming at the very end. Where's the rapture? The rapture is right smack dab in the middle of the entire 7-year period. Mid-tribulation rapturists believe the rapture will occur exactly halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. So, similar to the pre-trib model, as you can hear in the name pre-trib, mid-trib allows for the church to enter into the 70th week, but they have to remove the church prior to God's wrath proper being poured out. This is owing to numerous passages that promise that the church will not experience the wrath of God. That same underlying theology is what drives the pre-trib rapture as well, in that they also don't believe that the church will experience wrath. So they just go on to conflate the term tribulation and wrath, and so that the entire 7-year period is seen as simultaneously the tribulation as well as the wrath of God. And that's why they keep the church out of all 7 years. Mid-tribbers say, no, we don't think that the entire 7 years is God's wrath, but we do think it's tribulation. So they begin to fine-tune things just a little bit, and I appreciate that. So mid-tribulation rapturists believe the rapture will occur halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. Let's move to the next one. The next one is the post-trib rapture. This one is wildly popular, especially among people who are dissatisfied with the pre-trib. I find that many post-tribbers are former pre-tribbers or something to that effect. So what do they hold to? So let's just highlight it real quick. Post-trib rapture. First and foremost, their rapture and their second coming are all together at the very end of the 7-year time frame. I believe they still refer to it as a 7-year tribulation. Basically on this chart, you can see that God's wrath and the tribulation parts, the first and second half, they both occupy the entire 7 years. So, but in the pre-trib model, the rapture is at the very end, right on top of the second coming. The salvation of Israel is still at the very end. In fact, in all 4 models, as far as I can tell, the salvation of Israel is at the very end. The big difference that the post-tribbers do is they put the church into the 7-year period and have the church go through the entire 7-year period. So again, they've got their 3.5 years at one side, which is their tribulation, their 3.5 years of great tribulation, beginning at the midpoint at the second half. Post-tribulation raptures believe the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 7th week. And what they do with this is, in order to simultaneously allow the church to be inside of the time period that is labeled God's wrath, but yet not be destroyed, they introduce a concept that we do find in the Bible, although I believe there's no need to use this concept in the 7-year time period, but nevertheless, they borrow a concept that found way back in the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, where Israel was in Egypt while Moses and Pharaoh were going head to head, and there was this smackdown, right? judgment taking place against Egypt, where we've read the story, right? You've seen the movies, Prince of Egypt, or the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, or one of those movies, or you've read the Bible, right? That's the first and foremost thing. But the point is, Israel was right in the middle of the plagues that were falling down all around Egypt, but yet at some point in time, I can't remember where it started. I think it's with the fourth plague or so, but it didn't start at the beginning. But at some point in time, Moses tells us via the narrative that the plagues weren't affecting Israel, even though Israel was right in the middle of Egypt. So Israel wasn't out of Egypt yet, but they were in the middle of it. They were all in this little place called Goshen, and as a result, God supernaturally protected them from the plagues, so that the judgment that hit the Egyptians didn't strike his own people. Eventually, God did rescue Israel out of Egypt, take them out physically. That's a kind of a rapture there as well. But he took them out of Egypt. Egypt pursued. Israel went through the Red Sea. Egypt pursued, and at that point in time, the waters came crashing down on the Egyptians, destroying Pharaoh and his armies, but Israel survived the ordeal. So there's a lot of elements to the story that allow post-tribbers to try to borrow that scenario and say, just like God did it back then, he's going to do it again. Well, here's my take as a pre-wrather. I believe that some of the elements of the Egyptian story and God protecting his people in the midst of wrath will actually happen in the 70th week. But I don't think it's going to play out exactly the same way to the point where all of God's people need to be through the entire 7-year period. We're going to find out perhaps tonight, I believe we will find out tonight, that largely the church will be raptured prior to the wrath being poured out, but national Israel needs to be sheltered in place right here on planet Earth and be protected. So we can have both going on. I'll flesh all that out tonight, so stick around for the entire study to understand the pre-wrath position. But in closing, as I'm describing the post-trib rapture, the rapture of the church for them is at the very end, and it's simultaneous with the salvation of national Israel, both taking place at the very end. And as a pre-wrather, I follow a lot of the theology and the sequencing of post-trib rapture, but I don't understand why they flatten out or collapse. That is what I mean by flatten out many of the details of the book of Revelation when it comes to understanding the timing and the sequence of the rapture in relationship to what is often termed the second coming. Okay, so that's their position. Let's look at the final one, which is the position that I hold to. This is the pre-wrath rapture. This is a view that's relatively new in name. It's only been around since the 1990s, early 1990s. However, the theology behind it, we believe, goes all the way back to the first century. It's just they didn't describe things that way. They were more kind of less. I could say they were less granular. The early church fathers, the way they described their understanding of the rapture, and certainly the accounts as well, I believe are that hold to a pre-wrath rapture, but the name was coined lately, and that gives some people the impression that this is a brand new teaching that shouldn't be trusted. Far from that. What does the pre-wrath teach? Let's just line it up here for you. The pre-wrath rapture, come on, do that little cute little, I didn't do it this time. Give me a second. I don't like that. Much better. Okay, the pre-wrath rapture. What do we have in our 7-year sequencing? Well, the first thing that happens is we've got a renaming of some of the time frames. The first 3.5 years is no longer called the tribulation. It's called the beginning of sorrows. Per Yeshua's description of this time period, he doesn't call it the tribulation. Therefore, why should I call it the tribulation? Will there be troublesome, tribulational type things happening during that first 3.5 years? Absolutely. Ever heard of the 4 horses of the apocalypse? Yep, I have. Don't want to meet those guys. But unfortunately, I believe we will. Not that there'll be literal 4 horses and 4 riders. I'm just speaking metaphorically, understand. But the events about that are described during that first 3.5 years, I believe that everyone on planet Earth will be around to see that go down. including Christians. The second thing that happens is that the second half of the 3.5 years, the second half of the 70th week, i.e. the second half of the 7-year time frame, commences at the midpoint with the time frame known, or the period time known as the Great Tribulation. That's when that kicks off. However, that time frame, we believe, will be interrupted by the rapture of the church, the coming of Yeshua, which includes the resurrection, by the way, the coming for his bride, all those who are already prepared to meet him at that moment. A number of significant things are going to happen with the coming of Yeshua. Again, we've got resurrection and rapture simultaneously happening, but on the same day, the initiation of this time frame known as the Day of the Lord will also commence. Back to back, we believe. All right. So the Day of the Lord commences with the coming of Yeshua, which itself interrupts the Great Tribulation, which began at the midpoint of the week. The rapture itself and resurrection also is the initiation activity that kicks off this great event known as the Second Coming. The Second Coming is the Day of the Lord, but the Second Coming involves a number of activities. And so in that time frame that is marked out on this model that's called the Day of the Lord or God's Wrath or the Second Coming, it's bookended by two significant activities. The initiating event of the Second Coming is the rapture and resurrection. So the rapture is the Second Coming, but it's only the initiating event of the Second Coming. By comparison, the culminating event of the Second Coming is the Battle of Armageddon and the salvation of national Israel. Those are the culminating events. They're both near the end of the week. I would put Israel's salvation proper at the end of the 70th week itself, right on top of the 7th trumpet, and I believe that most of the other models do that as well. But the actual Battle of Armageddon would be 30 days later. In fact, it's 30 days past the entire 70th week. But we'll get into those details on a different day. Germane to my point right now is that the rapture, the Second Coming, and the salvation of Israel are part of one event. So it's similar to the way that post-tribbers think it's going to go down. However, there is a separation, at least by 5 months, if not a year and 5 months, between the rapture/resurrection and the salvation of Israel at the end of the 7th week. So the rapture itself doesn't take place at the midpoint. It doesn't take place at the very end, but it's somewhere there in the middle, but it's at least 5 months separated from the 7th trumpet, because the 5th trumpet alone lasts 5 months. That's how I know. That's why I'm so confident that there's at least a 5-month space between the rapture and the 7th trumpet, which would be the salvation of Israel. So, in a nutshell, Prewrath rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the 6th seal of the book of Revelation. The church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away. That's the Greek word harpazo, which gives rise to the English word rapture, from where I think it's drawn from the Latin word rapturo or raptura or something to that effect. But the church will experience his persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. So in describing pre-wrath, what I mean to convey is that similar to all the other 3 models, we believe that the church will be spared the brunt of God's wrath. It's just how he does it is a little different than, say, the post-tribbers. Post-tribbers believe that we're going to be here on planet Earth while the wrath is being poured out, but we will be supernaturally protected no matter where we're at. I'm not putting it past the fact that God could do that. I'm simply saying there's no need to speculate when we've got scriptures that describe a rescue/salvation event known as the rapture that accomplishes what we need to happen to the church, which is protect us in the midst of God's judgment being poured out. So that's what I'm referring to. So let's go back to where we're at in the study. What is driving our study is that gotquestions.org has this essay. And in the essay, we asked the question, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-wrath view of the rapture? We've already surveyed the other three views. Go back and listen to previous teachings, watch previous episodes of videos. Go to my YouTube channel at youtube.com at Tetzei Torah Ministries, or just go to YouTube and search for my name, Ariel Hanavi, and you'll find Hanaviy, and you'll find my YouTube channel that way. So gotquestions.org proposes that a few weaknesses of the pre-wrath view. Excuse me. There are two main weaknesses that they found. One of the weaknesses is this question. They believe, or this statement, they believe, this is pre-wrath, this is gotquestions.org, which is operating from a pre-tribulation perspective. Gotquestions.org holds to pre-trib. They are like your standard average evangelical Christian church that holds to pre-trib. They're the most popular view. They surveyed the pre-wrath position, and there's weakness number one of two that they found. They call it a weakness. I don't, but here's what they said. The elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. We pre-wrathers do believe that the elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. We believe that the church is described by Yeshua in the Olivet Discourse. Pre-tribbers see this as a weakness. That's why I said down at the bottom, so says many pre-tribulation rapturists. In time, we'll look at the second weakness. They think that the fact that the seal judgments are not the wrath of God, they think that's a weakness, because we pre-wrathers do not believe that the seal judgments are the wrath of God. So we say the seal judgments are not the wrath of God. Pre-wrath believes they are the wrath of God, and in time we'll get to that. We'll address their assessment of that. So back to this one. Pre-wrath believes that the elect of the Olivet Discourse is the church. Pre-tribbers see this as a weakness. How did I address this? In this, my own essay, let me go ahead and read this particular conclusion just real quick. This will bring us up to speed. In conclusion, the pre-wrath view offers a more cohesive understanding of the identity of the elect in Matthew 24 across the New Testament. Rather than limiting the elect to ethnic Israel or proposing a new group of tribulation saints, pre-wrath recognizes the elect as the unified people of God, both Jewish and Gentile believers in Messiah. This reflects, I said, the apostolic teaching of a single olive tree into which all who believe are grafted without denying Israel's continued significance in God's redemptive plan. I went on to say, pre-wrath also rightly interprets Jesus' warning about the Sabbath in Matthew 24:20, which, by the way, this was one of the supposed proofs that pre-tribbers offer that the 70th week does not belong to the church. They frequently mention that the details that Jesus gives to the disciples about, pray that your flight will not be on the Sabbath day because of certain hardships. And pre-tribbers point to this and say, see, if this were the church, why would Jesus be warning us about the Sabbath day? Clearly, pre-tribbers say, the church is not under the law of Moses, so we don't need any warnings about Sabbath because that doesn't concern us. It's an empty warning to us. This must be for Israel. These warnings about the Sabbath must be for Israel. This is proof, they say, that the Olivet Discourse passages, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, those are the Olivet Discourse passages. This is proof, the pre-tribbers say, that the church is not in the 7th week of Daniel. It's not in the 7-year tribulation at all. It must be raptured prior to it even ever going down. That's what they say. Well, I went on to say that I think that we pre-wrathers, we interpret Jesus' warning as a practical regional concern for Judea, not as a theological boundary marker separating Jews from Gentile believers. The consistent language of saints throughout Revelation confirms that God's people remain on earth during the Great Tribulation and are not divided into separate classes based on timing. I went on to conclude, Ultimately, pre-wrath upholds one gospel, one spirit, and one unified gathering of the elect at the return of Christ, and that this view avoids the unnecessary complications and theological inconsistencies introduced by this phantom term, the tribulation saints only. This particular tribulation saints only model exists in the pre-trib theology. It maintains our view, the pre-wrath view, actually maintains the integrity of the church's identity and honors the biblical sequence of end-time events. So pre-tribbers have to introduce this concept of, well, there are believers in the tribulation. What do we do about them? And they call them tribulation saints. They make up this name. And so at this point in time, I addressed that topic head on. Why are so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place, right? You can see the very end there. I'm just sewing together these two screens so I don't have to scroll all the way up and down. So I did this little excursus in this commentary called, Why are so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place? Notice it says Excursus 1. There's actually 2 excurses. We're going to get to the second one tonight. Just doing the recap right now. Why are the so-called tribulation saints needed in the first place? Here was my answer. I'll just read the summary to Excursus 1. In short, this was my understanding, my assessment of their position. Tribulation saints functions as a theological patch in the pre-trib system. Without them, without these phantom saints known as tribulation saints, by the way, let me pause. I do believe there will be believers in the middle of, throughout the entire 70th week of Daniel at certain points of time, but we have this big reset when the rapture takes place. So for a split moment on planet Earth, there will not be a single believer left. However, it's likely that immediately after all believers are raptured from planet Earth, that at that moment, the sealing of the 144,000 also takes place. And the perhaps salvation of those 144,000 also takes place. There's some disagreement among others on this view, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because the 144,000 are not part of the church at the moment of the rapture. So their sealing takes place either immediately before the rapture or immediately after the rapture, sometime around that time. They're mentioned alongside each other in the same chapter, Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7. But the point being is that they're not, it could be that they're not believers, but they are sealed against the wrath of God that's going to commence. Remember, in the pre-wrath model, the rapture initiates the day of the Lord's judgment. But the judgment cannot fall on the 144,000 until it can't even fall on planet Earth until 144,000 are sealed. So whether they're saved at the time of the rapture or not, I can't say for certain, although I'm inclined to believe that they are not saved, because if they were saved, they automatically become part of the church. And so they would have been raptured if they were saved prior to the rapture. So that's why I say that the rapture takes place first, and then immediately after that, they are sealed and then perhaps saved. Right? But they're definitely sealed, but whether they're saved or not. Now, why does this matter? It's because this kicks off the first group of believers that exists inside of the 70th week of Daniel, specifically inside of the day of the Lord. And this begins a new responsibility, a new people group that bears this responsibility to, now you could say they're still part of the church in one way, but they didn't get raptured because that was for the Gentile swelled group of what we might call the church. Any Jew who belongs to the church prior to that, prior to the rapture, obviously, it was going to be raptured. What's my point? We don't need tribulation saints. Everybody who comes to Christ after the rapture is still part of either national Israel that becomes saved or part of the church, or again, really once you're saved, you're part of the church. You're part of the body of Messiah, whether you're Jew or Gentile. We're going to flesh this out in a moment. But we don't need to create this imaginary patch of people or second-class citizen of people called tribulation saints that are not part of the church. They are still part of the church. They just didn't go in the rapture when the rapture hit that big reset button and yanked all the believers off of planet Earth. So without this tribulation saints patch of people, group of people, the model faces serious narrative, theological, and biblical inconsistencies, which is why I believe the pre-tribbers invent them. And one of the biblical inconsistencies is particularly how Revelation describes believers enduring through the tribulation. But as Prewrath pointed out, this creates its own problems. Number one, it invents a second class of believers dividing the body of Christ. And number two, it removes the Holy Spirit's indwelling presence, all of which lack clear biblical support. So that's basically where we left off. Now, at 30 minutes into this hour and a half long study, all of that was basically a recap of what's driving my discussion at this moment. We're finally ready to turn into Excursus 2. The rapture gathering fulfills Israel's covenant calling and includes all who are in Messiah. And I went through that lengthy review. I normally don't do that, but I took time to do that because the topic I'm going to embark on right now is an excursus. However, it's a difficult topic to wrap your mind around if you have already been indoctrinated by the dispensational pre-trib view that the church and Israel are two separate entities, right? Dispensationalism. And in so teaching this view of dispensationalism, which undergirds the pre-trib view, you are left to the conclusion that the church and Israel are separate and that the salvation of each group must have a hard break. However, let me go back over to my slide here for a moment and prep you. In order for us, I believe, to appreciate the fact that the church and Israel are not completely separated, but are in fact overlap with one another, especially at the remnant level, we begin to entertain the idea, this is the model that I'm putting forth in the Prewrath rapture model, that the rapture itself is connected to the second coming at the initiating end, the front end, but yet the second coming will result in the salvation of national Israel at the seventh trumpet. Are you following? So the pre-wrath rapture is somewhere around the sixth seal, but it's definitely before the seventh seal and before the first trumpet. So the rapture of the church kicks off the second coming, which is also known as God's wrath, which is also known as the Day of the Lord. So the second coming, as you're looking on the screen right now, the second coming, God's wrath, and Day of the Lord are all the same event. And there's only one of them, people. There's only one second coming. The rapture is connected and joined to the second coming, but only as the initiating activity that kicks off the second coming. But the very important salvation activity known as the salvation of national Israel is part of the second coming, and it takes place at the very end of the 70th week, occurring at the seventh trumpet. And why am I stressing this? It's because the rapture of the church and the salvation of national Israel are connected via the single second coming. So one could read Bible passages that talk about the rapture, and one could read Bible passages that talk about the salvation of national Israel, and begin to see that there are some common overlapping themes and perhaps language associated with the two of them, which is probably why the post-tribbers conflate those two events. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is that the rapture gathering must be seen as part of this promise that God made to Israel, is covenant calling. Remember, Israel is not going to be left to fend for themselves. Eventually, God is going to rescue national Israel from the clutches of evil Antichrist empire that's enslaving her, as well as bring her into the fullness of the covenant that she has been promised from a long time ago, from way back to Papa Abraham. And so we must connect the rapture and what people might call the second coming, or the rapture and what I'd rather call at this point in time the salvation of national Israel. We must connect those, but we need to do it properly because there is some sequencing going on. One takes place first, and that's why I'm slowing down a slightly bit. Now, we've got 30 minutes to go through this commentary. We'll see how far I can get. I'm not going to rush, but I don't want to dilly-dally either.